Hello and welcome to another of my Unity tutorials. Today we'll be looking at how to create the basic first-person shooter functionality for our game. In this case, we're already starting with a scene that has a first-person controller. Whenever I play, I've got this character I can move around and look around in first person. I also can jump. And if this is something you don't already have, then you can go ahead and follow the link in the description to the first person character controller tutorial. It's very excellent. If you get stuck with that, then do let me know. So we've already got our first person controller. Now we're just going to add some shooting mechanics. The thing about first person shooters is there's actually many different mechanics that all come together to create the experience of a first-person shooter. So we're going to start with some really fundamental basic stuff. It's not going to amount to much to begin with, but over time we'll start adding more and more features. The first thing we're going to learn about is instantiating prefabs. So prefabs are objects that we can drag from our scene to our asset folder, which means then we can have lots of different versions of that prefab and we can demonstrate that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new 3D object cube. I'm going to press F to zoom in on this. We're going to try and make it the shape of a bullet. Well, it's not really a bullet, it's a large extended rectangle. Well, actually we want it to be very tiny. Let's just make sure that that's tiny compared to the scale of our player. We want to be able to see that we're shooting out this projectile. Make sure that you, whenever you scale it, that you are scaling it on this blue axis, with the blue axis being the forward of the position. We're going to be moving it along this blue axis, as it shoots out, like perhaps like some sort of laser bolt from Star Wars. So we want to make sure it's scaled on the right axis, and then we can make it, maybe we can make it red, or we could create a new material for it. So we've got this cube in our scene hierarchy. We want to turn that into a prefab, and we simply, well, I'm going to rename it first just so that the prefab has a good name. Oh my goodness, I can't spell. Projectile. There we go. And now I'm going to drag my projectile game object from the scene into my assets folder. Now I have a prefab of that projectile. That means that I can manually drag in this projectile, right? And now we've got multiple different versions of the projectile. But whenever we shoot with our gun, we're going to want to do this, but we're going to do it in code instead of by hand. One thing that we can do is delete all of the projectiles that are in our scene and instead double click on the projectile that's in our assets folder. And now we've got this sort of isolated view of the entire prefab. I'm going to make sure to zero out the X, Y, and Z values of the position of this projectile. This can sometimes just be a good idea because when we spawn in our projectile, we want it to be exactly at the position that we spawn it in, not with some strange offset. All right, the next thing we're going to want to do is add a new script to our player character. I've got the player here, so we're going to add a new component here, and we're going to call this script shooter controls, or something like that, shooter controller. And this will just be our new script for handling all of our first-person shooter stuff. Once I've gone ahead and added that component, I'm going to open it up, and we'll open it up in Visual Studio, and we can start adding some code. Oh, this is just a strange thing that I have to do because of .NET frameworks. I'm going to change the target. That should be fine. All right. So here's our shooter controller that we've got. Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is instantiate, and that just basically means spawn in. Instantiate means that we take the prefab and we make an instance of it, a bit like you can have instances of classes. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and create a new variable to instantiate from. So this is going to be a reference to our blueprint, or not a blueprint, what am I teaching Unreal? A reference to our prefab. So in this case, it's going to be public game object, and this will be our projectile. My goodness. Projectile prefab. All right. So now we've got our prefab. We can then make sure to save that script, and you'll see that in our projectile prefab, we've got a reference now in our script. Oh, sorry, not in the prefab, in the player. We've got a reference variable here, projectile prefab, to a game object. Let's go ahead and grab our projectile prefab and drag it in. Boop. So this could be a reference to a game object that's in the scene, or it can be a reference to a prefab game object. In this case, we're going to want to make it the prefab. Now, When are we going to spawn in our prefab? Well, we only want to spawn it in when we're firing. And again, we'll do some maybe more advanced stuff later, but for now, we're just going to do input dot get input. This should probably be familiar to you by now. We're going to use get key down. So every time we fire, in this case, key code dot mouse. I'm pretty sure mouse 0 is left click. Let's see, the left or primary mouse button. Yep, so mouse 0 is going to be the input we're looking for in our condition argument. And then if this is true, we're going to want to spawn in our projectile from our prefab. And we're going to do this with instantiate. So instantiate is going to be the static method. And what argument does it take? It takes... Let's go ahead and I'm going to type in this little comma, and by doing that, it allows me to see automatically what these different variables are it's looking for as arguments for instantiate. We've got the original object and then the transform, which is its new transform. Well, the original object is this, our variable here, projectile prefab. So I'm going to copy this in as the first argument. And then the second argument is the transform. However, I'm going to go ahead and say that we don't want it to have any transform because ultimately, we want the objects, we want these projectiles to be moving independently. If we made them a child when they instantiated of an object, then whenever you move around, they would move around. So we're going to go ahead and say null. Null is a special value for a game object reference or a transform reference or really a class reference of any kind. And it basically means that there is no reference. So sometimes that's required. I'll show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and say semicolon. It's complaining about something. It expects... oh, we forgot our if statement. We can't just do import.getKey. We have to say if input and then put that whole input thing inside our if statement. Let's make the indentation a bit cleaner there. We're going to save that out. Now let's see what happens when we run the game. So now whenever I click with the left mouse button, I'm spawning in the prefab, but you can see it just spawns in here. It doesn't spawn in anywhere else. And every time we click, we're just spawning it in the same place. However, you can see all of these clones are appearing, which are the projectile that is spawning in. It's instantiating in. And they can all independently move. They don't have a parent because we made the parent null, the parent transform. Okay, so now what we're going to have to do is set the rotation and position of these objects relative to where we're looking, where the camera is looking. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new local variable, which is the game object. And this is going to be the new bullet. And the new bullet we're going to say is assigned to instantiate, because whenever we instantiate, there's a return value. You can see there at the very start, game object. Object.instantiate, and in this case it's going to return the game object that it just made, which we can then immediately assign to our new bullet. Then we're going to want to go ahead and do new bullet.transform.position to set the position of it. In this case we want to set it to the same position as this. Oh no, we need to get a new reference. So we're going to want to set the position and the rotation, so .transform to position, and then also later on .rotation is equal to, and we're going to set these both to be equal to something, right? So it's going to be equal to a transform. So let's get a new variable here, public transform, which is going to be our spawn transform. And then I haven't quite worked out what this spawn transform will be yet, but let's set it to the position of that spawn transform and also the rotation. So let's see, when we spawn in our object, we're setting the transform and the position to the same position and rotation as this spawn transform variable. So what should we assign it to now in Unity? So we've got this transform here, spawn transform. Well, whenever we fire with our projectiles, we'll want them to come and shoot out wherever we're facing with our camera, which means that if we make our camera object here that we're rotating around the spawn transform, then the object will spawn there and face that direction. So let's go ahead and click, and now you can see I've sort of created this projectile where my camera is. And there's a sort of strange jolt that happens, and that's because we've got a collision that we don't want to happen. So we're going to go ahead and go to our projectile, we're going to go to our box collider, and we're going to say is trigger, because we're going to use this collider, but not to prevent characters from walking around and bumping into it, but instead we're going to use it like a trigger box to determine whether it goes into someone to to damage them or going into a wall and it will destroy itself. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we're spawning in our projectiles. We're going to want to make the projectiles move, and they're going to shoot straight ahead. So we're going to go ahead and make a new script this time for the projectile. So we're just going to make our script called projectile. Yes, blah, blah, blah. I want to change it. Okay, sometimes it doesn't open, so I'm going to double click on this again. So we've got our projectile open. So very simply, we want to move it every frame. We want to move it forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to go transform.translate. Now I want to talk about this transform thing here. Whenever I use transform with a lowercase t, I'm not referring to the class, which is called transform with a capital T, but I'm instead referring to a variable that every component has. There's two key variables that every component has by default, and this is where this monobehavior thing comes from. Or why it's useful. Monobehavior means that it's a component we can add to our Unity object, and it also comes with some variables that are standard. For example, if I do transform, that I'm referring to the transform that component is attached to. And similarly, if I do game object with a lowercase g, do you see the way I've got two options here, with a lowercase and with a capital case? That will refer to the object this component is attached to. So this is a really fast way of getting the object or the transform that the component is attached to. In this case, our projectile script as a component is attached to our projectile object, this one here. And so whenever to move it forward, instead of getting a reference to a variable, which we could do, we can simply do transform with a lowercase t. So we're going to do transform. We're going to use the translate method of that transform component, and it's looking for two arguments. It's looking for a direction to move it in, and then it's also looking for this space, special variable, which is to say whether it's local movement or world movement. So we're going to want to go ahead and grab the transform. Again, we're using this transform lower t to grab the component, transform.forward. That will get the forward direction. Do you remember when I was trying to scale us correctly? That's because we're going to move it forwards on this blue axis here. So we're going to do .forward. Classic multiply by time.delta time to make sure we move independent from our frame rate, and then we're also going to multiply it by speed. So that means we're going to have to make sure that speed exists. So, and that's not how you spell float. There we go, public float speed. And now we've got the speed variable, which we can then multiply by the movement that we're moving. And then finally, we're just going to do this world. What was it looking for? I'm going to do a comma to see. It was looking for space, so space dot world. And that just is telling it that we're moving it in the global sense, not in a local sense. So it will understand what this translate means. So I'm going to go ahead and save. Now let's see what happens whenever we spawn in our object. Well, I'm going to preemptively set our speed to 4, just to make sure. That can often be a mistake. You set your speed to 0, you're multiplying by 0, so it doesn't move at all. Let's go ahead and run the game. See what happens now when we spawn in these objects. Well, this is almost like a bullet, right? It's moving very slowly. And also it just goes straight through walls and continues forever. You can see this one, look, it just goes to infinity and beyond. Let's stop the game. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to do some collision. But before that, I'm going to go ahead and just set the speed to 10 instead. Make it a little bit of a faster projectile. So how do we check for collisions? Well, just like we were checking for collisions with our trigger boxes before, we're going to use this onTrigger.enter on our projectile. In this case, we're going to go ahead to the projectile script. We're going to make a new method, the void onTriggerEnter, and whenever we can scroll down to this, it will autofill when we just press enter on onTriggerEnter. Boop. So now it's got the correct argument, collider.other. So we can make our if statement, if other dot tag is not equal to, and that exclamation mark means not. If it's not equal to player, well, what are we going to do? The reason I'm checking if it's not equal to player is because whenever we spawn the projectile in, it's going to sort of spawn inside the player. We don't want to be able to shoot ourselves with our own bullets. So we're going to check to make sure that we're not colliding with the player. And just to clarify there, I've already set up the tag here, player, from the previous tutorial on our player object. So it won't collide with that. And now we're going to destroy And the argument we're going to feed into destroying is game object. And because this game object is the game object this component is attached to, that means we're going to destroy the game object whenever we collide with something that isn't the player. So whenever I shoot this bullet into this wall, hopefully it won't go straight through the wall. Oh, there it goes, straight through the wall. Okay. So something's gone wrong here. It's not correctly on triggering, and that is because this box collider has got on trigger, but one of the objects that collides in Unity for this to work needs to have a rigid body component. In this case, neither the wall nor the projectile has one, so we'll add a rigid body to our... Oops, not a rigid body to do. Yes, you're right, Unity, I am stupid. There we go, rigid body. And what we're going to do with this rigid body is we're going to not want it to use gravity because our bullet shouldn't fall. Well, we could make super high realistic bullet drop off, blah, 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 whatever. We're not using gravity for this purposes, and we're going to say is kinematic is true. And is kinematic is going to go ahead and mean that we don't collide with this object and bump into it, just like we would whenever we do is trigger as well. So we're going to go ahead and try that out. So now when we shoot at the wall and it disappears, it doesn't go into the wall. And you can also see it appear and then get deleted in the hierarchy. Do you see where it says it says over here projectile clone? And when we shoot loads of them by clicking over and over again, you can see them all disappear into that wall. All right, we've almost got the basics of our shooter mechanics. I just want to add one last wrinkle, and you'll notice that there's a lot of things here that are sort of wrong about these first-person shooter mechanics, right? So our projectile's coming straight out of our camera, which isn't ideal. Also, our fire rate is tied to just how many times we can click. Those are all things we'll try and solve in the next tutorial. But for now, the next thing I want to do is add at least some target practice. So we're going to add a new cylinder. This cylinder will be our target practice. I'm going to move it over here. This is going to be the thing we're going to try and hit. And we're going to give it a new tag. I'm going to go add tag to this cylinder. We're going to go to tags. We're going to go to our tags. We're going to add a new one. It's going to be enemy. So we've got a new enemy tag. Save that out. And when we go to our cylinder, we can now set our tag to enemy. Boop. So now our cylinder, we could also replace this with enemy. Our cylinder is something that we can collide with. So now whenever we're colliding with onTrigger enter, we can also check, we make sure to do this before we destroy ourselves. We're going to check if the tag is equal to, not equal to, but equal to enemy. Have to make sure we spell enemy the same exact way with capitalization that we spelt it in the tag. So our tag is enemy like this with capital E, so enemy like this. So if the tag is enemy, and in this case, not only are we going to destroy ourselves later on, but we also want to destroy the enemy whenever we do hit the enemy. So we're going to go to destroy. In this case, it's going to be other dot game object. So it's going to be the game object that is attached to the collider component that we just collided with. Let's save that out, and let's see if we can go ahead and destroy our enemies. I'm going to have to make sure I hit this guy. So boop. Oh, I missed. There we go. So we destroyed the enemy as well as the projectile. So you can go ahead and, duplicate this object. You could create maybe like a little target practice range, depending on where these are. We could turn that into like a time trial in the future. But for now, I'm going to say that's the end of this tutorial, and we'll improve our system later. Maybe you already have ideas that you can add, like a score system or anything else that you've already been doing in your own, from your own development in C# with Unity. But for now, I want to see, can you get this working? Oh my goodness, I'm really bad at my own game, as always. Let's see. Perhaps you can create a UI element, a crosshair in the center of your screen. Anyway, that's all for me, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.